Okay, so in this lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about a poem by Louise Bernice Halfe, and this is just some information about the author. So Louise Bernice Halfe was born in Two Hills, Alberta, and her Cree name is Sky Dancer. And her history or her past, she did attend Blue Quills Residential School, and that's been a subject that she's discussed in her poetry. She's has quite a long career as a poet and writer. She's published many books of poetry, and her most recent one is "Burning in this Midnight Dream" from 2016, and that's her response to the Truth and Reconciliation process and how the trauma from the residential school has haunted not just the survivors but generations and communities falling from that experience. So we're going to take a look at one of her poems from that collection from 2016 and get a closer look at this topic of how an Indigenous author like Louise Bernice Halfe is addressing the residential school trauma in her writing. Okay, so this poem is called "The Reserve Went Silent," and as I mentioned, it's by author Louise Bernice Halfe. So I'll just read the poem first here. The playground went silent. A lone robin hopped in the expanse of the yard, where once children scraped their elbows and knees, drew lines in the dirt for hopscotch, or designated the imaginary rooms of a house and lined the cupboards with mud pies. The yard, now empty, where once a lively baseball field of excited runners wore out trails between first base and third, where once the home base was a tattered mound of scraped-up dirt and scraggly grass. I see this now. I never saw the searing pain on my mother's face, nor experienced my father's eyes squeezed to dam his flood. Their world went mute when the Pied Piper played his organ through the reservation. My parents never spoke of the gash that tore through the families and gutted the whole reserve. Okay, so let's take this poem apart a little bit and see if we can understand kind of the main images and messages of the poem. So the first line, "The playground went silent." Again, that's a powerful image. You know, usually a playground is full of noisy, happy, excited children who are playing, and here we have the opposite. So it went silent. So a usually boisterous, happy place is now this cold, silent, lifeless environment. So our setting, I think we can see that this is like a reserve where Louise's parents, live, and she's looking at the playground where, there should be children and there were no children there. So it's the impact of the residential school system and how it's impacted this community and her parents in particular when she was taken away as a child. So the playground went silent is our first image. And then we have one sentence here where there is, again, enjambment, where the lines keep going, or the sentence keeps running off of a different line. So a lone robin hopped in the expanse of the yard, where once children scraped their elbows and knees, drew lines in the dirt for hopscotch, or designated the imaginary rooms of a house and lined the cupboards with mud pies. So that's all sort of one sentence. And here we have, just the only sign of life now is this little robin, a little bird, hopping around in the whole expanse of the schoolyard or the playground. And there was once children there who were playing, but all that has sort of gone or went silent. So at one point, children were playing. They were doing things that children do, scraping their knees, drawing lines in the dirt to play hopscotch, playing house, making mud pies, all of that, childhood play, imaginary play that children do. So this is kind of, it was once this lively, playful, full of life and energy in this environment, but now it's gone silent, and the only sign of life now is this little bird. So next sentence, the yard now empty where once a lively baseball field of excited runners wore out trails between first base and third. So again, we have a contrast between past and present. Now the yard is empty, but in the past it was once full of children who were playing, baseball games in the field. And now it's just this empty, desolate place. So we have, like a contrast between past and present. And then again, she continues, where once the home base was a tattered mound of scraped up dirt and scraggly grass. So the children, made do with what they had in the playground. Anything is possible. They had home base was a mound of dirt, but they were using their imaginations and playing and having a lively baseball game. But all that is gone in the present. And our speaker here finally sort of says I. So we have the inclusion of first person. So I see this now. I never saw the searing pain. Kind of a bit of a contradiction there where the speaker says, I see this now, but I never saw the searing pain. So we're talking about, again, present and past tense. So I see versus I never saw. So past and present are displayed here. So in the past, she never saw the searing pain on her mother's face, but she sees it all now. So our speaker is in the present, and she's looking back at her past, looking back at the impact on this community and on her parents in particular that the residential schools have taken. And she says, I never saw the searing pain on my mother's face, nor experienced my father's eyes squeezed to dam his flood. So she never experienced firsthand the pain that her mother experienced when she was taken away, and she never saw her father trying not to cry, but she sees it all now and realizes the trauma caused to her parents when the playground went silent, right? So when all the children were gone, were taken away, that this has had, an immeasurable trauma and toll on her parents' lives. And so pain, sadness, squeezed to dam his flood. It's a kind of metaphorical way of saying, to stop him from crying, to dam the flood from his tears. And then we have this image, their world went mute when the Pied Piper played his organ through the reservation. And it doesn't mention residential schools in this poem at all, but we know in context that that Louise Bernice Halfe does write about residential schools, and this poem is part of that collection. But I think because the setting is in a reservation and it's the empty playground that's being described, we can also infer that, okay, these children were once there, but now they're not. So what happened to all these children? They were taken, uh, they disappeared, right? And we have to kind of solve that mystery, and we can infer that, she's talking about the residential school system that took children away from their families, took them away from their parents, and created this, unspeakable trauma for parents and whole communities. So her parents, their world went mute when the Pied Piper played his organ through the reservation. So we have a bit of an allusion to another, like to a fairy tale, the Pied Piper, and that story, which we'll talk about in a minute. But their world went mute. So when something goes mute, it becomes soundless, lifeless even. So everything in their life that they knew, this life full of children playing, looking out of your window and seeing children playing in the schoolyard, or not in the schoolyard, in the playground, all of that has gone missing. And it's gone missing because the children have been taken away by this Pied Piper, whoever this may be. And so let's take a look or remind ourselves of what the Pied Piper story is referring to. So the folk tale or fairy tale of the Pied Piper, it's a well-known story, and it's, you can look up the Grimm brothers have a version, and also Robert Browning has a poem called Pied Piper. But the story is that this town of Hamlin had a rat problem, and rats again carried disease and plague and all that kind of stuff. So they wanted to get rid of the rats. So they hired the Pied Piper, who promised to rid the town of all rats by playing his almost magical flute that lured all the rats away from the town. So he was successful in leading the rats away, but the town's people didn't or refused to pay him because they had no money. So he took revenge, and kind of like a, monstrous boogeyman, played his pipe and lured all of the town's children away with him, and they all vanished, leaving the town desolate of children. So all the little boys and girls and everybody, all the children from the town were lured away by the Pied Piper, leaving the adults in Hamlin childless and devastated. So that's kind of the folk tale that Louise Bernice Halfe is alluding to in her poem. And the figure of the Pied Piper in the poem's case is the image of the residential school as being this sort of savior figure or beneficial source of education for the children. So it's the promise of a better future for the children, or the promise of something great. But the reality of it is that, it's kind of a kidnapping, seizing, and loss and trauma that's being enacted through this act of false promise. So that's kind of where this image of the Pied Piper comes in. So the residential schools, the government promoted the residential schools as if it was going to, be a benefit to the children and benefit the families and communities, improve everybody's lives. But it's just leading the children away from their communities and leaving this hole, this sense of loss in its wake, or in its path. So as the Pied Piper took away the children, what was left was parents, communities that were gutted. And what were left were, yeah, parents and communities that were gutted almost like a fish is gutted, right? If you think of the gash and the gutted, the alliteration of those two words in this final sentence, it does connote or tell us that there is this wound that's never been healed. And the parents have never spoken of this to the speaker. So it's been this silent trauma that they've held on to for decades now that their son or daughter is now an adult and coming back to visit them. The parents have never really fully recovered from that loss when all the children went away. And it's not just her parents, but families and the whole reserve. So whole communities were gutted in that way and traumatized by the loss of the children. So it does provide us, the poem as a whole provides us with a clear description of trauma and the silence that's been hanging over a lot of people who have been, unable to even communicate the trauma that they went through in that loss, and how it's been silenced, just as the playground has been silenced as well. And it also gives us an indication that, the hidden part of, or the reality of the residential schools was hidden, right? It was portrayed as something on the surface that looked like a good idea. It presented itself as a education system that could benefit children, leading to more opportunities. But the reality is that it caused, so much pain and suffering and horror, not just to the children themselves who were abused, but also, as this poem says, to the parents that were left behind who lost a whole, who lost that connection to their children, and whole reserves, whole families, whole communities were also traumatized. So it does tell us, like, there was a little bit of there was a hidden agenda or hidden monstrosity to the residential school, but that's not how it was portrayed to the people. Initially, it was perceived as a solution or a beneficial enterprise or system, and that's not what it became. Okay, so I'll leave you with that thought. And if you're interested in looking up the Pied Piper story or the poem, you can look up the Grimm's Brother version or the Robert Browning poem to get a better sense of that story, if you want to remind yourself of that kind of folk tale.